I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And joining me is longtime guest Chris Temple of the National Investor. Welcome again, Chris.
Hey, Mike, good to be with you as always.
Yeah, well, we've got a different topic today, and it's one that's fraught with all sorts of disinformation. So hopefully, we're going to clean up some of the muddy waters. We're going to talk about de-dollarization.
Well, de-dollarization is a hot term in some circles, especially there's political ones, the gold bugs, the crypto bugs, everybody else. It's like everybody is pining to dance on the grave of the U.S. dollar for a variety of reasons that usually have to do with, well, that means the gold I have will be worth more, or the Ethereum that I have will be worth more, or whatever. But as I always try and do, when my motto is you can get information anywhere, but here you get knowledge. We're going to dispense a little bit of knowledge today to put all of this in a proper context and really help to define our terms. But Mike, before even that, just so people know where I'm coming from and my motivation, I hope I live to see the death of the US dollar as the global hegemon and the global reserve currency. And I don't say that because that means whatever gold or related investments I have will be worth more. I say that because the world will be a safer place, because the US dollar regimen, since the end of the Second World War, and this country's ability to compel most other countries, whether they like it or not, to support this dollar regimen, has been the muscle for an awful lot of evil in the world. A lot of national leaders have been assassinated, a lot of countries overthrown, a lot of dirty tricks by the deep state of the US, all underwritten because of this bottomless pit of these dollars. So I would love to see that go away. I would caution my fellow American citizens, however, that have this view, to be careful what you wish for, because that may well bring us to the point where, unable to get the rest of the world to support these bad habits any longer, as we've done for many decades, our debt will have to really be purely inflated away, and that'll be the time that you'll want to be in a business of selling wheelbarrows. I probably won't live to see that part of it, but I hope. I worry about my 18 grandchildren and what kind of world they're going to have. And that's why I take an interest in these things. So anyway, I just wanted to let my own motivation be known, that I'm certainly not a fan of the dollar and all of the things that it has enabled, but I try and look at things in a sober sense. And I'm here to tell you today, and we'll talk about a few aspects of this, Mike, that 90% of what you're hearing about de-dollarization is the usual nonsense from the same usual suspects, that whether they're selling gold or books or cryptocurrencies or whatever, that have been telling us for years that any minute now the dollar's going to be gone, and it's not true.
No, I agree with that statement wholeheartedly. Let's start the conversation with the basic 101, and let's define exactly what it should be meant by the term de-dollarization, because I hear all sorts of discussions on de-dollarization that have absolutely nothing to do with de-dollarization, that they're managing to make it sound like it does. So, you hit me with what your definition of de-dollarization is.
Well, look, first of all, let me back up one step and lay a little bit more of a broad foundation. It is very definitely true, and I have said this myself, as you know, many, many times over the last couple of years or so, especially, that the world that we have all known and operated in and been citizens in and consumers in and investors in since the end of World War II, where the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, it is the kind of center of gravity for the global economy, for global markets, et cetera, that world is going to be going away. It's not going to go away in one fell swoop, but we have already seen the process begun where the rest of the world wants to have other choices. They don't want to have a gun to their head all the time and be told what to do and how to do it and what they can't do by the US, which has been able up until now to use the US dollar and the SWIFT settlement system and all the rest of these things as weapons to keep everybody in line. That sentiment against the dollar and that start of the movement away globally on the part of many nations from the dollar has accelerated dramatically in the last year and a half. As a lot of people predicted at the time when the US was finally able to goad Russia into this proxy war over Ukraine, the sanctions that had been placed against Russia and indirectly against some other countries by the US primarily and the EU acting as the US's lapdog, they've backfired. They have had virtually no effect. Russia is selling oil to India, for example, which resells oil and refined products to Europe. And everybody knows it. Everybody knows that they're all skirting the sanctions this way. They put on a face like this isn't happening. Okay, but this has been idiotic from a policy, political, foreign policy, economic standpoint, the whole deal. What's happened is that unlike prior to the start of the proxy war over Ukraine, a lot more of this trade now is being done in rubles. A lot of it is being done in Chinese yuan. So you're seeing the beginnings of this de-dollarization manifest itself, and you're still talking about a fairly small percentage of all trade, most of which still is settled in dollars, especially when it comes to commodities. But it's not an insignificant percentage of these things where day-to-day trade is being done in other currencies. You and I have talked before about the BRICS block of nations and how many nations, even former supposed allies of the US, like Saudi Arabia, they want to get into the BRICS block now and expand that again, just so everybody can have alternative choices. There's separate movements afoot in South America, a consortium of countries down there that want to have their own regional currency, be free of the dollar's influence to the extent that they're under it still, and that's a fair extent. So, all of these things are going on and we read about them every day. There's no question about that. But number one, it still is a small percentage of all global trade. The big one, Mike, and which is where a lot of the people talking about this stuff just hysterically to try and scare people into buying whatever they're selling. It's a completely different kettle of fish when you're talking about the dollar as a reserve asset. Okay. That is something that is going to take much longer to upend. It's one thing to do day-to-day transactions in rubles, or I want to mention China specifically because there's news out today about disinvestment from China because people don't trust China. But, the idea that anybody other than the US, maybe Europe, although their economy is a basket case and their banking system is still a basket case. Other than them, there is nobody on this planet that has the kind of a system that people are going to trust longer term with their money. So these different countries can flip the bird all they want to the US, which is widely hated, deservedly so in some ways. But it doesn't mean that these same people want to buy a barrel of oil or a cargo ship of grain or something with Chinese yuan are going to keep that money parked in Chinese institutions for any length of time.
No. And ultimately, the way I look at de-dollarization is the same as I would look at a barter system, essentially. Rather than paying for everything that's priced in US dollars, they're using an alternative form of payment. Let's use Ghana as an example. Ghana needs oil. Ghana doesn't have a whole lot of US dollars, but Ghana has a lot of gold. So they worked out a deal where they could essentially sell their gold for yuan take that yuan and turn buy the oil that they needed from Saudi Arabia, or essentially turn their gold into the oil that they needed. And they weren't going to be able to do that, through US dollars, and it wasn't necessarily going to be a profitable trade for them in the long haul. So to me, that is de-dollarization.
Sure.
They've skirted the use of US dollars to pick up that. The same as if you were to trade your lawnmower to your neighbor for a barbecue. You've never turned any US dollar over. So you as an American on that exchange, did a de-dollarization exchange in a lot of ways.
Right. And that's a good analogy, and that's exactly what's going on. You have a desire, and the US has been its own worst enemy with the idiocy of our foreign policy and using the dollar and the SWIFT system as weapons. The rest of the world's had enough of it. And you're going to see more and more of this as the years go on, where you're going to have other currencies used. No question about that. That in and of itself is not going to have an immediate impact on the exchange value of the dollar if you see this trend really pick up steam to the point where you're getting to first 10% and then 20% and then 30% of all global commerce done in currencies other than the dollar. Now you're talking about a different matter, and over a period of time, that, all else being equal, is going to erode the exchange value of the dollar against other currencies, because there won't be as much demand for it. People won't need to continue bidding for dollars to have them to buy goods. So long term, it's going to be certainly net negative for the exchange value of the dollar against other fiat currencies and against gold, of course.
Yeah, that's true. But I also look at it in a different fashion. As the world reserve currency, the United States is obligated in a lot of senses to run large trade deficits with practically everybody in the world in order for them to have US dollars for them to buy commodities and goods that are priced in the US dollar. So in effect, if those countries that the US really doesn't do a whole lot of business with on a normal basis, find an alternative means to pay for the goods that they need other than in US dollars, the US, in my mind, is no longer obligated to be running huge trade deficits with those countries, and can more effectively buy their, trade for goods that they need with people that maybe are better at supplying those goods. Would that not create actually more efficiencies in the US economy if the de-dollarization moves down the road further?
With the right policies in place, and that's the operative term, or, terminology here, Mike. Yes, you're right. For example, part of this whole process of de-dollarization is part of what I've already termed the World War III, which is already underway, where commodities and currencies are concerned. Now, if we got aggressive in the US as a country in onshoring anew a lot of production of commodities and finished products and other things that we currently get from other countries, then you mitigate the need to have a whole bunch of dollars running around the world if we're able to take care of things more so within our own four walls. Like it or not, that trend is going to be forced on us by the economic realities and monetary realities of what de-dollarization over a long period of time is going to do to this country. So we certainly don't have a government right now that seems to get this and understand that we need to have an urgent crash program in place to start to open and reopen mines, to bring back manufacturing, to even out frankly, and this might sound crackpot to some people, the pay scales between management and labor with industry, so we can afford to pay better prices for better goods made within our own four walls. So we're going to have that forced on us by these events. We'd be better off today in understanding how we're going to be going down this road and to take the steps we need now to do this. And of course, that isn't happening by and large, regrettably. But you're right. That longer term, this could be a good thing with the right policies. It would give America control again of a lot of the things we need for everyday life.
Well, yeah, that's one thing that the pandemic certainly taught us, that having our supply chains far away from home isn't necessarily a good thing from a domestic policy standpoint,
No
especially
question.
in a crisis.
Yeah. That's right.
Now, the other thing I wonder about too, Chris, is the de-dollarization. Now, we're talking realistically at this stage, we're talking at government levels. We're talking about governments buying and trading in goods internationally between each other. But if you look at some third world nations and the shopkeeper in the local market, if he has a choice between a US dollar paying for his goods or the local currency, they're going to choose the US dollar every time because it's more stable than the local currency. It holds its value better. How are these BRIC sort of nations going to be able to essentially force the dollars out of their country if the perception is that that the US dollar is still more valuable than the local currency?
Well, you make a good point, Mike, and it underscores what I said, that a lot of this de-dollarization business has been misrepresented or grossly exaggerated, of course, for many years still to come. You're going to have the dynamic that you just described. I was interviewing a CEO of a company the other day that operates in Argentina, and I was asking them questions about the outlandish inflation rate down there and how they navigate this as a business. Of course, Argentina's government has there's still some that leaks out, but they have export controls on the amount of US dollars that are presently in the country, because they essentially have a bifurcated system there. You've got the dollar economy that runs industry and whatnot to a great extent. You've got the peso economy that the hoi polloi have to live with and try and keep up with. So yeah, I mean, and this underscores what my contention is that it's one thing if, partly at least as a poke in the eye to the US, a lot of these other countries want to say, well, we're tired of your policies. We're tired of being told what to do. We're tired of you starting wars and insurrections and all the misery and whatnot that comes with dollar hegemony. So we're going to start doing business with other currencies. Well, that's fine as far as it goes. But when it comes to, again, what people trust, you made the great point that a lot of people on the street, you give them a choice between an Argentine peso and the US dollar, guess which one they want every time? Is the US currency if they can get their hands on it. And that also, is the case with where you've got bigger fish to fry. I alluded to this a minute ago, Mike, but it just came out. The Financial Times reported this yesterday. CDPQ, the big Quebec investment group, has stopped investing new money in China. They're closing their office in Shanghai. That follows actions by Ontario's Teachers Pension Fund, which is another big investment fund that invests money in all different kinds of things all over the world. That also follows the decision of Singapore's Sovereign Wealth Fund that has slowed down its investment. Why is this? There's two reasons. Number one is you have, beyond the trust factor of currencies as reserves, okay, you have this trend that is accelerating of deglobalization, which to me is the bigger trend that is driving the de-dollarization longer term. You're going to see countries wanting to do business closer to home or at home. A lot of alliances are fracturing, new alliances are being made. So this is one reason why, and the US is driving some of this, because the next proxy war we're going to have in a bigger way is going to be the US and China. It's inevitable. Both sides, I think the US probably wants it more than China does, but China is going to answer. So you've got this deglobalization thing going on, where everybody is pulling their horns in and wants to operate closer to home. In the case of Canada, you'll probably see some of this money that was going to China or maybe to Africa and elsewhere is going to go into the critical minerals industries developments in Canada, for example, and eventually in the US, although Canada is ahead of us on this. So that's one thing. But talking about reserve currency specifically, last year, I'm going to use round numbers, of all of the reserve balances in the world, okay, countries who via their central banks or otherwise have sovereign money from their own country and others in their currency / institutions, nearly 60% of it was in the US, 20% of it was in Europe. I think 6% was Japan. China hasn't even gotten up to 3% yet. And the rest is a smattering of, everybody keeping a lot of their own money at home, whether it's Canada or whoever else it is. So that's a situation you've got, and that's not going to change anytime soon. Eventually, it'll start to change when you do see the volume of trade in currencies other than the dollar continue to rise. That will bring about with it the need for China and its yuan to be looked at as a reserve. You've got to park money in institutions there, and that's going to be your launching pad for other trade and investment and whatnot, etc. Okay. But before you get to that point, again, sticking with China as the example, because they're the one everybody claims is going to be, the one next week that's going to replace the dollar. Nobody in their right mind today parks money in China for any period of time. They don't have the rule of law that we do. They don't have the transparency that the US and other Western central banks do. They don't have the accountability. They don't have any of this. Not to mention the fact that when you add public and private debt both together, they've got a higher GDP or debt to GDP than anybody on planet Earth. Now, they have done better at least getting something useful out of their debt by a long shot than we have here in the US, but it's still there. So a lot of these calls for, the dollar's, stint as the reserve currency is going to end soon. Well, it's going to end. I would take the word soon out of that. Where I think we're heading is we're going to have a fractured global financial system. We're going to have a fractured system of trade and how trade operates and so forth. Don't forget too, as part of this whole thing and driving all of these different trends is something that the Western governments primarily have been the biggest forces pushing for, and that is global carbon emission reductions. Well, how do you reduce carbon emissions? You create taxation and rules and whatnot that penalizes you if you're a company. The more miles that are required to bring goods to you that you need to use. So this is why when we're talking about, I hope I'm not getting too crazy and rambling here, but this is why, if you're in North America, you want to look at some of the better, I'll just use one example, nickel projects in Canada or the US, as opposed if you're an end user and you're based in North America, because the added taxes you're going to pay to import nickel that's not produced as clean as some of these emerging deposits can be produced here. You're going to pay a lot extra money for a pound of nickel if you're bringing it from Indonesia and some other places. So all of these things are pointing to stop rambling. All of these things are pointing to a world where, first, as we've seen the beginnings of, other currencies are used to transact goods and services. Eventually, that will become more the case, so much so that it will require parking places other than US dollar-based institutions for these larger and larger sums of money. But we're likely many years from the point where that's going to make a huge difference in everything.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. It's, as I say, what I look at, it was what everyone's talking about is the dollarization. Just it's not going to happen overnight. And what we're seeing is the world starting to reverse its course from globalization to deglobalization, and that yes, we're going to need to work more closely with people who are closer to us rather than shipping goods all the way around the world. Like I personally could never figure out how it was cheaper for us to send raw materials all the way across the ocean to China and some of the South Asian countries, have them turn those into goods and send those goods all the way back across the ocean again to North America. I couldn't see how any of that made any sense.
Well, it made sense for a while. In fact, people that really want to look into the whole genesis of China's emergence as a global power. And I know that this article was in the Atlantic Monthly many years ago. I think it was carried by others where you could pick it up. But look up the title of this author was Lou Lehrman, Lehrman. Once upon a time, he was a Republican candidate for governor in New York State. He lost to Mario Cuomo at the time. But he wrote an article basically explaining that China started out as a mercantilist colony of primarily the US, where we did exactly what you just described, and other countries did too, but the US did it the most. We created the biggest vendor financing scheme in all of history, the biggest transfer of goods one way and hard dollars the other. And by sending raw materials and to China, having the cheap labor there, put things together, bring them back here, and even taking the shipping both directions into account, it made for cheaper goods than what were going to be produced in the US. Now, that's not the case anymore. And it's one of many reasons why this globalization regimen is unwinding, and why we are going to be stuck for some time to come with chronically higher inflation and thus chronically higher interest rates than we've been used to as the norm for the last 40 years.
Yeah. You've often talked about a return to the Monroe doctrine, and I've had a chance to give a lot of thought to that. And I wonder if the de-dollarization will not actually be good for some of the South American countries, in that they have the commodities there. If manufacturing happens there at the same time, could we not get rid of that inflation by, rather than bringing the factories home to America, bring them sort of home to South America?
Well, that would be nice. And again, looking at it from the US's standpoint, but tragically and criminally, the US leadership, and I put leadership in quotes, is all about bases in Syria and starting wars in Ukraine and insurrections elsewhere, while we let China come in and make deals one after the other with South America. It's China that is going to develop the lithium reserves in Bolivia. It's Ecuador, though, because of the lack of a government there right now until the snap elections I've been talking about take place later this summer, they can't ratify it. But President Lasso just signed a trade deal with China that is going to be immensely beneficial to Ecuador to export a lot more of its products to China. We should never have tolerated these things. We should have long ago understood where things were heading, Mike, to your point, and made sure that instead of bribing and cajoling and threatening and dirty tricks and stuff like that, that we're a positive partner for South America, because after all, it is natural for people in this hemisphere to do business with one another because of efficiencies, lack of transport across oceans, and for all the other reasons, not and the strategic ones as well. But we have allowed China to set up shop in most of the countries of South America, which now, with the widespread scorn against America from just about everywhere, they're happy with that situation. It's our own damn fault that we got to that point, because we should have long since re-embraced the Monroe Doctrine and said, okay, China, you can, play ball over in your part of the world, but stay the hell out of ours, and make sure that positive incentives accompany those positions when it comes to the Ecuadors and Bolivias and Argentinas and the rest of South America. But we've driven everybody away. We drove Russia into China's arms as an ally, and we've even driven away most of South America to anybody but the U.S.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a mess of our own making in a lot of ways.
Right.
So the last question that I had about the de-dollarization then is that it's not the death of the US dollar, but it's the death of the US dollar as being the main trading currency. Is that the way we should be looking at this?
Well, initially, yes. You're going to see, it's going to be 20%, then 30%, and then more as the years go on. The proportion of transactions globally in commodities, chiefly, of course, that are done outside the US dollar. What will follow that will be the erection in places like Russia and China and perhaps other places of first world style banking institutions that will deserve having a lot of that money parked there as reserves. And that's where it'll start to get more dire for the US dollar's value globally, because when the point comes that we no longer have a lot of the rest of the world underwriting everything that we say and do, because they're required to support the dollar and its hegemony, then we got a problem. Then we're left with having to fend for ourselves currency-wise, not just for commodities and things like that. Thankfully, and hopefully, because this whole process is more likely than not to play out over a period of many years, we've got the time, if the right people and the right policies are put in place, to be able to mitigate the impact of a lot of the rest of the world not needing the dollar anymore and not being compelled to support it. Hopefully we get that leadership sooner rather than later, and those policies sooner rather than later. Otherwise, as Americans, we're going to see our living standards as time goes on suffer considerably as the U.S. loses support for its currency and for the present world.
Well, the one elephant we've left out of this room in this discussion, we've talked pretty extensively about Russia, China, a lot of the third world, and let's call them emerging economies. Europe, where does de-dollarization leave Europe?
Europe, and they have done more harm to them in a self-inflicted fashion, frankly, than even the US has, and that's hard to do. But keep in mind, number one, that the state of their banking system, the health or lack of health of their banking system, is far worse, generally speaking, than what we have in the US. They never really did recover from 2008. Whereas the U.S. banking system, generally speaking, again, was able to get reliquidated on a far better way than Europe did. Europe as an economic engine globally is on a decline, more so than the US. The anchor country of Europe, Germany, seems especially intent on some strange suicidal tendency. I mean, I just did an interview with INN, Charlotte McLeod. It'll be posted at the beginning of next week. And we were talking, among other things, about uranium. And everybody on the planet has embraced, properly so, the resurgence of a nuclear power industry globally, except for Germany, which incredibly did follow through with shutting down its remaining reactors. And they think it's better to strip mine coal, and they become the bane and the laughing stock of the whole world, whether it's economically, when you look at the idiocy of what they've done to their economy, or whether it's environmentalists who properly are looking at them doing nothing to go in the same direction everybody else claims to be going. But you go from clean nuclear power that emits nothing but water vapor to now you're going to strip mine large areas for coal to power your economy. It's madness. So, Europe is going to plod along, but it's not going to be a global power. And this is a great thing to end on, kind of a half funny and half crazy thing, Mike. But I remember vividly when in the late 90s, the euro was about to be unveiled. And you had all of these dispensationalist wackos in some of these fundamental Christian circles who insisted that this is a sign that the end times are here. The Antichrist is about to show up and be unveiled any minute now, because you've got this global currency. This is the revived Roman Empire being put together with the euro currency. What a damn joke. Okay. And the same sorts who were scaring people over that are telling people, for years now, that China or some new IMF currency or whatever is going to replace the dollar any minute. It's just as cockamamie a story as the euro being the one world currency of the Antichrist kind of thing. Europe is just about as ossified today as Japan is.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. My final word on it is that I don't think that the US as a reserve currency is going to end anytime soon, because as Rick Rowe would like to say, it is the prettiest horse in the slaughterhouse, but it's also very stable. And one of the challenges that I've always had with Bitcoin was that if we operate under the notion that it's a currency, which I don't, it would take these huge fluctuating leaps on the positive and the negative, so that you really had no true idea of its value from day to day, where for most countries, they have a pretty good idea where they stand against the US dollar on a day-to-day basis, and it doesn't fluctuate generally in most nations in wide swings. And I think that's ultimately what's going to allow it to maintain some of its hold as the world reserve currency. But I see de-dollarization as other nations starting to trade in other forms, just so that they can. And as you say, it's idiocy that's been brought on by ourselves.
Right.
If people want to continue to follow you and reach out to you, how do they do so, Chris?
Easily just go to nationalinvestor.com, sign up for my mailing list if you're not already on it. There's going to be a few things coming out in the near term that go into this de-dollarization thing more, and really even deeper than that, into where we're at with the Fed and how a lot of people, with again, overly simplistic or overly thematic views that they have about the Fed and whether we're going to pivot or pause or this or that. A lot of commentary out there is missing the forest for the trees. And I'm going to get into that a lot too in the near term. So sign up. You don't want to miss that.
Absolutely. And as always, we live in interesting times, and good to have lots of things to talk about.
For sure.
Till the next time, Chris.
Take care.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.